My name is Francisco Dueñas. I think I'm going to hide folks that are not speaking. I think folks are not sure if folks are looking at my screen right now or if they're looking at the various presenters. So why don't we just start off with inviting everybody in and thanking you all for joining us today. My name is Francisco. I'm with Housing Now, and this is a webinar that we've organized with coalition partners, BARHII, the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative, CCHO, the Council of Community Housing Organizations, REP-SF, Race and Equity in All Planning Coalition, San Francisco, and BMSG, the Berkeley Media Studies Group. Today's webinar is going to look at how we shift housing narratives in the news and how we can educate journalists on the intersection, the nexus between housing, health, and racial justice. So thank you everybody for joining. I think we've got around 58 folks currently joined. And we are going to have interpretation today in English, interpretation from English to Spanish and interpretation from English to Cantonese. So let me invite our interpreters to provide a little bit of instructions on how those interpretation is happening. Manson, can you hear me okay? And do you want to give a quick interpretation and invite and welcome to folks in Cantonese?
Yeah, sure. 各位，我姓梁嘅，我係安老自助處，我今日嚟做翻譯嘅。今日嘅會議咧係由5、6個唔同嘅組織一齊喺度咧係講解教你哋點樣去面對傳媒，即係好似電視台或者收音機或者任何傳媒嚟訪問你咧，係你點樣可以為你嘅社區咧可以表達你嘅意見嘅。Go ahead, back to you, Frank.
Thank you. Thank you, Manson. And Alexia, can you share a little bit of a welcome and instructions on how to use the interpretation feature for our Spanish speakers?
Yes. Hola, muy buen día a todos. Mi nombre es Alexia. Estoy interpretando la reunión entre el inglés y el español. Vamos a estar utilizando la herramienta de interpretación de Zoom, que todavía no está activada, pero una vez que se active, van a ver el pequeño icono en forma de globo que va a aparecer en la parte de abajo de la pantalla. Le dan clic ahí y seleccionan su canal inglés o español o el que deseen. Si está en una tableta o en un teléfono, le dan clic a los 3 puntos donde dice More al lado derecho. Después van a interpretación de idiomas y luego seleccionan su canal. Asegúrense por favor nada más de darle clic a donde dice Done, que es el botón azul o finalizado para poder encender los canales.
Thank you very much, Alexia. So we're going to go ahead and start our interpretation. And then please choose your channels. Okay, everybody should be able to select their language channels now, and the interpretation is going to be happening simultaneously. And if folks haven't yet, please add your name and organization, your pronouns, and one housing issue you're working on in the chat. That way we can see where folks are calling from, are not, joining us from today. And then we should go ahead and get started. So just to share with folks, this is just a little bit of the agenda for today. If folks, we're hoping folks ask questions, and the Q&A function should be working there. You can also use the chat function to chat with each other and chat with us. It has a star on the chat then that's a chat coming from us, the organizers. And just a reminder to all our presenters to speak slowly so that our interpreters can make sure to follow along.
Francisco, while you're getting the slides up, people are mentioning the chat's disabled. I don't know if we can fix that. If not, we can use the Q&A.
Okay, I think I just changed it. Can folks check it now? I think we should be good to go. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. So I apologize. Kathy, can you remind me who's taking this first section on?
It's you. I can share the slides, and then it was you taking it on.
Okay, sure, absolutely.
Logistics.
Great. So just to thank you so much, Kathy, for sharing the slides. Let me just are folks seeing this slide? Okay, thank you. So many of you on this call probably already know that the connection between housing and health is foundational, and it is, inextricable. And so the partners that put this guide together, who are going to share a little bit about what is in the guide and how they use the guide, have identified how the coverage of news around housing impacts the way that, different public and policymakers are perceiving housing. And it also is helping to set the stage for what's possible in terms of our housing solutions. We all know we're in a housing crisis right now, and we need to have folks be with us in terms of the various different solutions that are needed. And how the news is covering the solutions that are possible is important. And so I think that's why folks came together to put this guide together. And we are hoping that this helps to help advocates when they are engaging and supporting journalists, and that will result in changed news coverage that helps shift the narrative. To just share a little bit about our theory of change here. And we are hoping folks can, use this guide when they are engaging with their local journalists, and view this as a resource. There are questions and story ideas in the guide that folks can use to shape materials. Many of your organizations, institutions have your own media that you put out there, whether it's blogs or websites, your social media. And so the questions and story ideas can be used to help shape that output and that outlet, as well as when you are engaging with journalists, this is material, this is ways to engage with different journalists and be able to pitch them stories or op-eds, press events, ways to incorporate, these various recommendations. And then finally, in terms of ways that advocates can use this is to just increase your awareness of the news that is out there and have a better sense of how it's getting reported. And we will make sure to save the chat. Thank you so much for that suggestion.
And I'm going to talk a little bit about the guide, but we did have one comment in the chat about the Chinese interpretation being on the wrong channel. So I don't know if someone can troubleshoot that while I go over this part. So yeah, we're very grateful to be here today. These are the foundations that have provided support for us. And this guide started before the pandemic. Berkeley Media Studies Group has been around for a long time, really because there's so much important work happening. And sometimes in, public health or other areas, we're not always as adept at communicating that to policymakers or the broader public using the news. So we started doing some work with BARHII and CCHO, and CCHO was doing amazing work educating journalists, and sometimes it was very time consuming. It would take days, and then the stories would be okay or sometimes good, but the idea came that, well, let's put together a lot of what CCHO and BARHII and others are learning by doing this media work into a toolkit to help journalists. And so we decided with this guide really to focus on housing being fundamental to health, because BARHII and BMSG do come from a health lens. We looked at how news coverage influences, we wanted to look at news coverage because it influences how the public and policymakers perceive housing, what solutions even seem viable, and it sets the stage for how we respond. And we at BMSG really look at, if we want to shift narratives as the backdrop for shifting our systems, part of it is preparing advocates to speak effectively. And then part of it is getting journalists to ask different questions that really get to the root causes. And so we see this as, sort of bridging those, but definitely supporting journalists. So we know that this guide is really aimed at journalists, but we are speaking to you all today, mostly advocates who are on the ground doing work, because we want to let you know it's available. We are curious in the discussion to see how you might be able to use it or ideas. We want to think with you how we can get it into the hands of journalists, even as a whole guide, or even just some of the questions. There's recommendations in here, and the questions people have said, even if they're not a journalist, might be helpful for thinking about how we write as advocates our own blogs, our websites, our social medias. We might be able to pitch stories or op-eds that really follow these recommendations. And then the guide includes a news analysis that we can look at as a baseline. So the table of contents of the guide is the news analysis. BARHII really spearheaded an analysis of Black housing in the news, and really pushing us to think about, that's a really missing story angle. So how in our organizing can we make sure that's out front? There's recommendations, before and after stories, a really comprehensive glossary, and then other resources for reporters. I do want to mention that we always at Berkeley Media Studies Group, we do different reporter guides on different issues, but our staff include both public health and journalists, but we know journalists, like data, and we want to present them not just with our opinions of what they could do different, but with it grounded in an analysis of what we saw in the news. So the guide our research team looks at what's in the news, who's speaking, who's missing, different things that could have been done differently. And that's really the cornerstone of making these 5 recommendations, is it's grounded in this analysis. It is in the Bay Area. We do think the recommendations are relevant nationwide. We do know Bay Area news tends to have a history of mentioning terms like redlining or talking about segregation. And so that may not be the case across the country. So there may be a little bit more work in other areas of the country to introduce these terms and make sure they're clearly defined without jargon on our side as advocates. But we do think the general recommendations will hold true. So what we found in the news analysis is that housing policies are reported on, which is good. In other areas, a lot of times the whole policy landscape is missing. but there's often very little context. Why this policy? Why now? How did we get here? Who's benefiting? And there's very limited focus on the solutions. In promising news, there were connections between housing and health. This was mostly related to COVID, and that's when we were doing the news analysis. So our assumption is that now that there's less coverage on COVID, the housing and health beats will separate. And we'd love to see that connection solidified, because we think talking about housing issues from a public health frame engages more stakeholders and really forces policymakers to acknowledge the human toll, that this affects people's lives, and they can live shorter, sicker lives because of housing, or as a society, we can come together and provide a foundation for health. And we also saw very few stories delved into racial inequities in housing for the Black community or other communities of color. So there's a lot of opportunity to bring racial equity into news coverage about housing. And I will turn it over to Lee. She's going to talk a little bit more about what's in the guide.
Thank you, Kathy. And as Kathy pointed out, there is so much housing jargon. And sometimes with the news coverage, you can also see that some of this jargon language, for example, around redlining, becomes the focus for people today to actually advocate for policies that hurt our communities of color and working class folks. So we really want to make sure and share this with advocates that the guide is used as a tool so that you're grounding the conversations in what happens to people on the ground, working class people and vulnerable folks. Kathy, can you go to the next slide? It's easier as we scroll through. So there's a lot that's packed into this guide, and in an hour, we don't have the time to kind of run through all the recommendations. We also want you to do this in an intuitive way, because as you go about your work, you organically understand how news about certain issues are missing the mark. So we want you to use this tool in a way that really focuses on the areas where you see the greatest need to put out the stories in the media, to encourage reporters to talk about the equity angle. But briefly, I'll summarize the 5 recommendations from this housing justice toolkit. So the first is to capture underreported angles on housing stability and affordability, what is not being talked about. The second is to report on solutions and how they address racial, income-based, and other inequities. So not just the problems, how are we solving the issue? The third is to cultivate expert sources among those most negatively impacted. So the expertise lies on the ground in our communities. The fourth is to report on the intersection of housing and other issues. So Kathy and others have mentioned housing and health, housing, health, criminal justice, transportation. There are so many other issues that connect with housing. And the fifth is to describe the history and the people or organizations who benefit from housing policies. So really understanding the context, what has happened, what is continuing to happen, and how to set things straight. So again, briefly for the recommendations, what is not being reported? What are the solutions? Who are the experts? What are the intersections with other important issues? And who's being impacted and what are their histories? So we can go to the next slide. We won't spend time to go into these components of the toolkit, but we just want to show you what this can look like when an advocate works with a reporter, or a reporter really comes to a story with a better equity angle. Then they're always editing stories. Their editors tell them to do that. They're always refining what they put before it goes out into print. And this is a process where we're helping to shape these stories so that there is an equity lens, so that there's information that's conveyed that reflects our communities on the ground. Next slide. The toolkit also has this glossary. And think of a glossary not just as a dictionary that you're always sort of turning to, but it is trying to capture what is going on that's both policy and political, and again, what's happening to people on the ground when you talk about the housing affordability crisis, right? Again, we're mindful that it's easy for people to kind of seize on the narrative because it's politically convenient. But we, folks who have been doing this work for years understand how important it is to use the language to really ground it in the struggles of our communities. Okay, next slide. So we want to really center just kind of focus on one of the recommendations and have two of our speakers today kind of dive into this more. And that recommendation is, how do we cultivate expert sources among those most negatively impacted? And today we're going to hear from Darius Young at BARHII, who's really helped with the organization of this coalition leading on Black housing justice in the greater San Francisco Bay Area. And we'll also hear from Diane Ruiz, who's part of a powerful coalition called Race and Equity in All Planning San Francisco, and how they've really led these conversations to empower marginalized communities when you're dealing with this high-level stuff around land use and housing policy. Next slide. So it's important to try to use these tools in a way where you've got questions to pose to the journalists, but also to be kind of part of your, everyday language as you're like pressing, like what's being talked about, what's not being talked about. So some good questions you can ask as part of this recommendation. So where do structural racism and class interests intersect in this particular issue? So, we're trying to, and put this into language that also makes sense. So for example, if you're working with people who are living in SROs or people who are unhoused, ask them about their lived experience and how have they been shut out of the system, right? So translate into language that works for your communities. Who is directly impacted by the situation or proposed policy? So again, like if you're talking to folks you're working with to lift up their voices, translate this. But also if you're talking to the journalists, press them. Are they talking to enough people? Are they just going to certain talking heads? Another question is, who is speaking to the interests of the impacted community? And I think our two presenters can share about that because they're bringing together a lot of other organizations, but importantly, people who are out there fighting the good fight. And then last question is, does the proposed solution explicitly address affordability? We see that so much here in San Francisco, and I'm sure we see that in the region and throughout California. So next slide, and I will hand this piece over to Darius Young from BARHII to speak about their work.
Thank you, Lee. I appreciate that, and thank everybody else for setting the tone for this. My name is Darius Young, and I'm the Director of Organizing for African Americans here at BARHII, and that's actually Black Health. And just let me give you the backdrop of BARHII, just a little background. So we are the coalition of the government's bodies of health departments, the 9 Bay Area health departments. And we focus on those social determinants of health that impact health outside of the doctor's office. And those things, as you could imagine, their economics, their education, but and a whole lot of others as well. But one of the things that we found out was that in 2018, we did a study with the Federal Reserve, and it showed that housing, the disparities in housing was the #1 driver of health inequities. And so we started then to really hone in on housing as our health issue, our biggest health issue. And it was during the pandemic that we actually, in terms of media, we did have a media roundtable. And these are one of the tools that we actually use to try to get, reporters interested in telling, the full length of the stories. And so it was basically aimed at that, and it was led by BMSG, who helped us put it on. And it was talking about the COVID disparities. And we had housers on that call, people that were associated with Black housing, Black-led organizations. And so we start to come up with a strategy. And the strategy would be, how could we create a fund that would particularly focus on Black housing? And so what's important for BARHII about media coverage is that it starts to cover what we call the full story of housing affordability and health, and for Black communities in the Bay Area. And these things are that the things that we're doing, they kind of like make that happen. They make it true. And so one of the things that we sought to do in 2021 was to, in 2021 and 2022, was to create a Black housing fund for the Bay Area region, because we saw so many people leaving the Bay Area who couldn't afford to own homes. And so they were leaving places like San Francisco, Oakland, places like Berkeley, California, and they were going further and further out just to find affordability. And one of the things that we were able to do is that with our fund, which we call the Black Housing Fund, we were able to do a op-ed that was co-authored by my executive director, Melissa Jones, and Fred Blackwell of the San Francisco Foundation. And basically that was aimed at lawmakers so that they can take a look at, how do you create policy, right? What is the remedy for creating displacement, for eliminating displacement of communities that were at one time traditionally African-American communities. Now, you will see a picture of me standing on this basketball court in the middle, if you can see that. I don't know if they can see that. But we had a reporters roundtable in June of 2022, because we wanted to make a last push, our Black Hat Coalition, Black Housing Coalition, which consists of 50 or more Black-led organizations and supporters, to get into the governor's budget. And we had speakers from the city of Oakland's city council, one of the Alameda County Board of Supervisors. We had a state senator speak in our behalf. And it was to bring to awareness that at least this type of fund was going to be a prop for one of the solutions that can help ease the housing burdens for African Americans throughout the region. And one of the reporters picked up the story, and what they did was they wrote a pretty great story in the community that I grew up in, which was Berkeley, California, which at one time had a 40% African-American population, and now that population has dwindled down to 6%. And it's because of affordability in other areas as well. And so when you look at this toolkit and the recommendations of how we could use the media, I think it's important for us as advocates, social justice advocates, to really help our reporters fill in those gaps that are missing in traditional stories. Because if you look at the way that our story is told, like was already pointed out, you hear redlining, you hear gentrification, but what you don't hear are the other things that come along to make those things happen as well. And so there's other links that I think that we should be talking about in terms of policy. How did we come to this place where communities such as Oakland, San Francisco, Berkeley, and other traditional African Americans have lived prior to 1990 and the 1980s push. What were those other determining factors in state policies that helped to facilitate this displacement of residents throughout different communities and neighborhoods? And so when you think about the ways to engage local reporters or anybody that would wants to tell our story, I think as we look at this toolkit, we can use the recommendations as our what I would call our bedrock in order to present these conversations, in order to really lift up those things that would help the policymakers who actually do a lot of reading and they're influenced by media to help to pass policies that would ensure that these things, stories about African Americans and housing, that go beyond just the redlining pieces or the gentrification, but as to how other policies in California and throughout the nation led to these. And then we start talking about these are the solutions. We hand them the solutions. And if we hand them the solutions, then with media telling that story, you get a lot of momentum in getting these things done. And so that's what I would say the best uses for this toolkit are really are all about. Because at the end of the day, we all know that, when it comes to influencing thought, when it comes to influencing lawmakers, when it comes to influencing people who really don't know, media is your first line of where the stories are really come from that can be an influence on creating policies that go a long way in helping to ease our overburdened housing crisis here in California and elsewhere.
Thank you, Darius. Appreciate it. Next, we're going to hear from Diane Reese with RAP-SF. Diane, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Darius, for that great example. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm here on behalf of RAP-SF, the Race and Equity in All Planning Coalition. We're a coalition of nearly 40 grassroots community-based organizations, coalitions, affordable housing developers, cultural districts from all over San Francisco. RAP-SF was not part of the creation of this toolkit, but we appreciate the opportunity to give the perspective of on-the-ground organizations that might apply the toolkit and the challenges that we face in our work. So RAP-SF works for housing justice and equity in land use to empower historically marginalized communities to determine our futures. Housing justice and equity means that American Indian, Black, and other communities of color, immigrants, low-income and no-income residents, seniors, LGBTQ+, and people with disabilities don't just have a seat at the table, but have the power to build our visions for healthy, affordable, and diverse communities. So I'm the communications director for RAP-SF. This is part of my broader role as co-founder of nonprofit People Power Media, and our mission there is to build power for equity in land use, similar to RAP-SF. People Power Media founded and facilitates RAP-SF as part of our popular education, organizing, and policy work. So next slide, please. One of the main missions of comms, which is short for communications, within RAP is to shift the narrative. And to do this, the goal for us in shifting the narrative is simple. RAP-SF and People Power Media are working to shift the narrative to housing justice. This requires us to shift away from the dominant narrative, which is build, 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 And that is a narrative which developer lobbyists, the YIMBYs, which stands for Yes in My Backyard, have been successful in spreading through mainstream media, academia, politics, and policy. For REP, centering community expertise is critical to housing justice. Sorry if you are some background noise here, but I'm in a cafe right now. So centering community expertise is critical to housing justice for REP. YIMBYs believe that in the name of increasing housing supply, which is their blunt instrument approach to the housing crisis, we need to remove as much community input as possible to streamline the housing production process. This only serves to further commodify housing and continue to make it unaffordable for most people. But let's not get sidetracked too much in debunking this. Slide, please. So here are some examples of how REP is effectively shifting the narrative. We know that we need to make clear which solutions would actually work towards creating equity in city planning. So last fall, we created the citywide People's Plan, which puts together decades of community plans and combine that with the latest innovative policies using our on-the-ground expertise. From the beginning of REP, we made sure that our messages were targeted to both REP-based and persuadable audiences through value-based messaging. REP engages in popular education for its members, including our Planning to People trainings that provide some foundational knowledge about land use and the real causes for the crisis of affordability we now face, as well as effective communications. We are also training spokespeople, regularly get turnout for important land use hearings, and provide talking points and press releases for those hearings to make sure that the community perspective is heard. A major victory was that we were able to get several policy recommendations written into San Francisco's housing element, which passed earlier this year. Please. First, we're not without our challenges, and I'm talking mostly about the communications related challenges. So there's a complete lack of staff who are dedicated to doing comms work for the organizations. For the larger nonprofits in REP, they may have one staff person who's often stretched thin. Put that against our opposition, which is broadly defined as developer lobbyists from organizations such as YIMBY, the HAC, Housing Action Coalition, and SPUR. They are well funded by both the real estate industry and tech to clear the way for the build approach. They both create the communications to spread this approach and make it the only one that makes sense. And they've convinced a lot of people of its trickle-down benefits. But they not only do the comms, but they literally write the legislation that seeks to further commodify housing and deregulate by disempowering communities. A major, often unsaid challenge includes reprisals from the city and state to withhold funding to organizations that speak out against policies that would harm the community. Press release. Hopefully you're not hearing too much of the background. A press release went out earlier last week about how the San Francisco for example, they did just that, with holding funds from several nonprofits that San Francisco provide funding services for and all that rally was canceled, the issues remain. Apologies for the noise. I am in a cafe right now. And I'll try to speak slower as well. So reprisals are a deliberate tactic of our opposition, as evidenced by the trolling of the developer lobbyists on our social media, who often actually call for our defunding. Other challenges involve the nature of media. Today, dominated by few large media corporations For example, services chronicles from corporation. And there's also community publications standard funded and also the distribution of I apologize.
I'm wondering if you can maybe move your microphone closer to your mouth.
Okay. I just walked out of the cafe. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's
Great.
much better. Thank you,
Okay.
Dan.
Sorry about that. All right. Yeah, so one of the other challenges is, of course, the restriction of distribution of media through social media corporations. Generally independent media and movement journalism is not supported and not easily disseminated in the system. So there's lots of challenges, including at the newsroom level. It's hard to always pitch a new angle when, I remember one editor who told me, poverty isn't news, like what's something new that you can say about this? Next slide. I really appreciate the toolkit that we're discussing today and its recommendations on how to help shift the narrative. We will be implementing this at BREP, but also want to recognize some of the challenges that organizations will face in implementing these recommendations. Expert sources among those most negatively impacted were able to relate historic and systemic causes with equity-based solutions, along with a heartfelt personal story, don't just happen. Spokespeople from the community who can do all of these things come from base building organizations. We just heard about BARHII's great work, for example. So it's only through direct organizing and building a base that there are people to relate their personal experience with why they're facing the issues that they're facing and be comfortable enough to talk about this with the media. And it's through popular education and ongoing support of community spokespeople that we're going to be able to do this. Another challenge is that when the media does talk to folks, it's often within a particular box, only wanting to know their personal story, not looking at them as experts in their own right who can offer solutions. Housing is most often reported in terms of business news and, housing prices are falling, rising, or major new leases and developments. It's hard to get into that, A section of when we used to have physical newspapers or kind of the other parts of news. The next slide. So here are some actions that I think you all in the audience can take towards supporting some of the recommendations in this toolkit. Reporters need to take more time and focus on community experts, pay more attention to press releases, pitch stories from the community perspective, and just regularly talk to us. Foundations and individuals can contribute unrestricted funding for base building organizations and comms work. For organizations that do that genuine base building work. Organizations such as SOMCAN, South of Market Community Action Network, ODER, People Organized to Demand Environmental and Economic Rights, Housing Rights Committee, and organizations in United to Save the Mission, coalitions such as Mission SRO Collaborative, to name a few of the organizations and coalitions within REP. Thanks so much for posting the links to those. And incidentally, they're the ones that are often targeted for defunding. So In addition, the community does need to step up, and we need to have the resources to do so, to continue to organize, train spokespeople, using guides like this, pitch stories, engage in popular education, and a coordinated, effective communications effort. Next slide. So incidentally, the Race and Equity and All Planning Coalition does all of these things. Next slide. So we invite you to join the movement for housing justice by following us at Rep Coalition SF. You can also contact info@repsf.org for our coming town halls and to join the action team, and use that QR code to check out our link tree and get involved. Right, thank you so much, and apologies for the sound issues. Let me know if you want me to go over anything else.
Wonderful. Thank you, Diane. Really appreciate it. And Eileen put a good question in the chat. Folks can also use the Q&A function to ask questions. We're going to ask our panelists some of these questions and see if they have any additional, feedback or insights to share with you all. I just wanted to put in a quick plug. We are not delving into other resources that are out there for housing justice messaging and narrative, things that can help shape the experiences of your community members. And so I just wanted to highlight a few that are out there. Some of these are websites, some of these are organizations. The California Dream, it's a research project looking at messages that are trying to move as many Californians as possible on housing solutions that we need. There's a lot of research to dig into there, and as I mentioned in the chat, we will share all these links in a follow-up email so that you don't have to take notes. But another similar housing messaging research initiative is Housing Justice Narrative Initiative, and that is by a collaboration between PolicyLink, Race Forward, and the Center for Community Change. The previous one I mentioned, the California Dream, that's being spearheaded by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. And then finally, an organization that is solely, this is all they do, is housing messaging research, is the Housing Narrative Lab. And we are currently in this movement, in this effort, at a place where we're investing more in doing more research on the messaging and how it intersects with where people are at and that dominant narrative that Diane was talking about. So these are just a few of the resources that are out there, but it takes the community building, it takes the organizing that Darius and Diane shared with us earlier to connect all these dots, right? So just wanted to, maybe in the future we'll do another webinar on some of these narrative resources. But let's turn over to some of the questions that folks have. Eileen had asked, in recognition of the work that storytelling is and the trauma of continuing to resurface difficult personal stories, she was wondering if anybody, not just the panelists, but let's start with the panelists, and others please chime in on the chat, if anybody is using stipends or other types of, support, remuneration to members that are sharing stories. Diane, do any of your coalition partners, how do you all coalition partners approach that? And then we'll see if Darius has any feedback on that question.
Yeah, I think that it is great to offer stipends when you can. Maybe not every time it's that funding is available, but I think in addition to having to go over difficult topics, it is someone's time that they're spending with you. If you're able to compensate for that time, I think it's fine. And I think that it is common also in journalism to do that. So I think that it's respectful to be able to do that.
Thank you, Dan. Darius,
And
do you have any feedback on this question?
yeah, yes, I do, because I do think that it's important to make those with lived experience, make them feel as though they are experts in what they're talking about and not just a commodity that comes by telling a story. Because when we talk about people with lived experience, they are experts in whatever lived experience they're sharing in their stories. And so whether it's giving them stipends, which is included, or even finding a way to really, really get them engaged in the coalition and organizational piece so that they can find resources amongst the people that they are in coalition with, that's a big plus as well. Because I do think that someone like myself who has shared my lived experience in different circles when I first started doing organizing, there was a point in time that I started to feel more like a commodity, a story that needed to be told, but not as an expert that was really, really honing in to give solutions. And when I saw that the experts, people who they said were the experts, those, and not to knock anybody who's a teacher or a professor, what they were getting for appearing in webinars and conversation and on panels. I just think it's important that we acknowledge people with lived experience as experts, just as much as experts as those that come from policy work and things of that nature. So I would say that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Darius. And just pointing out that Arlene in the chat also suggested or threw out there that, folks can also partner with continuing therapy opportunities and just, resourcing our, storytelling efforts in that way, that really taking care of our community members and their needs. John had a question for folks, whether the conversation around reparations, California established a reparations task force, and obviously bringing in race and equity into the housing affordability conversation. And he was just wondering, has that opened up, have you all seen that opening up a pathway to improve news coverage on the affordable housing crisis?
So I can say,
it seems like go for it. And then we'll see if Diane also has something else. Mm-hmm.
I will say that BARHII, right now, we are engaged in a coalition of advocates. We're working with an organization called CCHO to work on the policies or the bills that now are going to come out next year, because the reparations task force has sunset. But just let me say that I think that when it comes to media coverage, and I'm glad you asked this, there's been a narrow focus. And the narrow focus has just been around one act of reparations, and that's direct payouts. And that's the story they tell. But they're not telling the story about the plethora of recommendations that have come out to address systemic inequities. And one of them, those are housing. And so there needs to be different types of stories told about that. Like, for instance, there was a recent poll that was taken by the University of California, and it lists all these questions, but it showed that if you looked at it, that most Americans believe that in California, those that were surveyed, that they don't need reparations, but yet they those that were polled said that there needs to be some type of solutions as well. And so what I thought was ironic, it was an op-ed piece that came out this weekend in the San Jose Mercury News. And it was about a person who was not Black. She wrote the news piece, and it was very newsworthy in that she was saying that, you know, when we put these polls, we need to put them into perspective, right? And so I would say what you're seeing is the same type of things. And I think that journalists could benefit from this toolkit in telling the reparation story as well, because we're only hearing it from one perspective, one group of people, and we're not hearing it from those that are impacted, but also those that have been helpful as well. And so I say that, you know, when you talk about this type of toolkit, this toolkit can go a long way in influencing better conversations or better telling the fuller story on what reparations are all about and the recommendations. So I would say that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Darius. Diane, did you have any feedback on that particular question?
Yeah, I think that you know, in San Francisco, you need to signal that you are for equity. And so I think as far as the conversation around reparations and kind of people being able to return to the city, for example, that they were displaced from, I think that's definitely in the narrative, but it can often be manipulated towards you know, disingenuous solutions. You can't just like, you know, have that intention to welcome people back without having affordable housing, you know, having opportunities for small businesses, support for community groups. You know, there are solutions already identified by groups to be able to, you know, genuinely have stable communities and be able to return to the communities that they were displaced from. But it's not just about welcoming people back. And I think that's sort of like, as far as some policies go, is like, we'll just build a bunch of new housing and that's enough to welcome people back. And, you know, that needs to be genuine efforts, not just for affordability, but to create stability and generational wealth that was, you know, taken away from so many communities because of redlining and other, you know, business and government policies.
Great. Thank you so much, Diane. Appreciate that. And folks should see on the screen now our email addresses. If folks would like to follow up with each of the presenters, we, you know, from the various different organizations that were on today's webinar. We had asked 2 questions from you all, and I'm hoping that we can hear back. You can email any of us, but we are wondering, you know, how do you all see you might be able to use this guide? We're always looking for feedback, especially after putting something like this out there in the world. Folks want to know what impact it had and how it can be even more impactful, right? So what would you, how else can we, what other help would be useful in supporting your efforts? Arlene put in the chat about, you know, training to educate individuals on the subject matter. It sounds like, for example, that's something that maybe SF or your coalition partners already do that popular education. And so maybe in that follow-up email, we could also include some popular education resources. People Power Media has this really great animated video about displacement and gentrification and the lack of affordable housing. So a lot of coalition partners do that education because they want to tailor it to their community and what's happening on the ground in their, you know, in their communities. Maybe they want to tailor it to a language or, you know, particular community dynamics. And so I don't think there's a general, I haven't seen a general, you know, housing justice curriculum out there, but I do think that there's a lot of other resources local groups are doing. And I think that is it for today's webinar. We're 1 minute over, and wanted to thank all our presenters today for joining us and sharing their resources, campaigns, and insights into how they've used or have taken advantage of these various different strategies for engaging with journalists and having the stories of their communities covered. So thank you again, everybody, for joining. Really appreciate it, and feel free to shoot us an email and let us know how the guide is landing for you all.